Welcome to Fulcrum Intel Digest, the podcast.
Today, we're tackling something fundamental in geopolitics, really. That huge gap between what nations say and what they do.
Exactly. It's the clash between global conscience, if you like, and global commerce.
And we're using the Israel-Gaza conflict here as a sort of, a stress test. It really throws into sharp relief how inconsistent major powers can be when humanitarian ideals meet defense economics.
That's right. If you just listen to the talk at the UN, the Security Council, the General Assembly, it's all very clear, isn't it? Demands for ceasefires, calls for aid, talk about international law.
Yeah, the high-minded declarations. But then our sources, when you dig into them, they show the same countries making those speeches are also, making sure allies are militarily equipped. We're talking arms sales, vital components, and just as importantly, diplomatic cover.
So our mission today isn't just to point out that contradiction. I think most people see that, but to really unpack how it works. We're going deep into the specific ways the UK, the US, and France handle this.
And looking at things like those UN walkouts or the ICC warrants, how do these symbolic or legal moments actually connect with the hard realities of national interest and trade?
Exactly. And for you, the analyst, the stakeholder listening, the key question becomes, what does this inconsistency mean for reputational risk? And maybe more crucial, how predictable are states really when their stated principles crash into their defense industry needs?
We cover more topics like this every Monday and Friday. So if you'd like to stay up to date, click the subscribe button and give this video a like. Now let's jump in.
Okay, let's dive in then. Starting with the UK, they seem like a perfect example of this diplomatic dissonance. Public restraint versus the reality of the supply chain.
Well, diplomatically, the UK has been pretty consistent on the surface. They've backed UNSC resolutions, pushing for ceasefires, aid access, protecting civilians.
They've cited the figures too, haven't they? The Palestinian death toll, hospital destruction, making the case for international humanitarian law, IHL.
Absolutely. They use the language of IHL frequently. BBC reports from 2024 mentioned over 65,000 Palestinian deaths, destruction of health facilities. The UK acknowledged this backdrop publicly.
Right, so that sets the standard they claim to uphold. But then you look at the money, the export data, and the picture. Well, it fractures. Our sources show between October and December 2024, the UK approved 127.6 million in export licenses to Israel.
And that figure, 127.6 million in just 3 months, is a huge increase compared to previous years, a really significant spike.
And it wasn't just, nuts and bolts. What kind of equipment are we talking about?
No, this was advanced military tech. Things like targeting systems, radars, and critically components for F-35 fighter jets. These are platforms known to be active in the conflict zone.
So the government must have known this looked contradictory.
Oh, clearly. Because in September 2024, they did actually pause about 30 other licenses. They explicitly stated there was a clear risk these items could be used in breaches of IHL. So they acknowledged the risk.
They drew a line, but then stepped over it for certain things.
Precisely. The F-35 components were the big exception, and the justification given is really telling. They argued it was essential to keep NATO and allied supply chains going. Basically, alliance obligations and the integrated nature of defense manufacturing trumped the specific IHL risk assessment for those components.
Alliance locking, you called it earlier. The supply chain acts like an override.
Exactly. It shows how deeply embedded these defense industrial commitments are. They create structural priorities that can sideline humanitarian concerns, even acknowledged ones.
And this wasn't just an internal memo, it went to court, right?
It did. In June 2025, the UK High Court looked at this exact issue, and they upheld the government's decision. They essentially said the government had the discretion to weigh the strategic supply chain needs against the IHL risks and continue the F-35 exports.
Wow. So the court effectively gave legal cover to the contradiction. It wasn't just policy, it was legally sanctioned.
That's the crucial point. For anyone analyzing UK policy, that High Court ruling is a benchmark. It signals pretty clearly that when push comes to shove, core defense trade and alliance security needs are likely to prevail over stated commitments to IHL restrictions. You know where the real line is drawn.
Okay, a clear, if uncomfortable, picture for the UK. Let's shift now to the United States. You said their model is different, less about internal conflict, more about strategic alignment.
That's right. With the U.S., the alignment between their actions and their diplomacy regarding Israel is, it's remarkably consistent. Washington is Israel's biggest military ally, providing $3.8 billion annually in military aid. That's the baseline.
And diplomatically.
Their actions mirror that support directly. At the UN Security Council, the U.S. consistently uses its veto power to shield Israel from resolutions demanding tougher accountability or immediate, unconditional ceasefires. Their stated priority is Israel's security, and their actions follow that explicitly. It's textbook diplomatic protection.
So if their military aid and their diplomatic actions line up, where's the contradiction for the U.S.? It sounds quite coherent in its own way.
The contradiction isn't internal, it's external. It's the massive gap between this unified U.S. policy towards Israel and the broader international norms and humanitarian laws that the U.S. itself champions elsewhere in the world.
So the hypocrisy is perceived on the global stage.
Intensely. It leads to significant diplomatic isolation on this issue, which you see starkly in UN General Assembly votes, where the U.S. and Israel often find themselves voting against huge majorities.
But let me push back on that a bit. If the U.S. consistently faces this diplomatic isolation at the UN, but doesn't change its policy, how much does that isolation actually cost them? Is it just noise, or does it matter?
That's a really important question. For the U.S., historically, the perceived domestic political benefits of their stance on Israel have far outweighed the costs of international criticism at forums like the UN.
You mean domestic politics drives it overwhelmingly?
Largely, yes. There's a long-standing, quite powerful bipartisan consensus in Washington supporting this approach. Influential lobbying groups work hard to maintain that. So, enduring criticism at the UN is often seen as a necessary, manageable price to pay for maintaining that domestic consensus and strategic relationship.
Okay, so that makes the U.S. position very predictable then, even if it creates friction internationally. What about France? Where do they fit in the spectrum? They often position themselves as a key EU voice on norms and law.
France tries to walk a finer line, more like the UK in some ways. Rhetorically, they hit all the expected notes, supporting humanitarian resolutions, talking up the two-state solution, warning against disproportionate force. They definitely value their image as a defender of international humanitarian law.
But the arms sales, do they manage to avoid that entanglement?
No, they don't entirely escape it, although the scale's much smaller than the US or that UK spike. France reported about 40 million in arms exports to Israel in 2024.
Still, 40 million isn't nothing.
It's not. And it highlights the broader dilemma for the EU. Many European nations pride themselves on normative leadership, on upholding IHL. But they're also involved in global defense industries, sometimes in joint programs with Israel.
So they're caught between their principles and their industrial base.
Precisely. For France, even those smaller sales create a kind of moral hazard. It slightly undermines their credibility when calling for restraint or accountability. There have been debates in the French parliament questioning if these sales are compatible with their stated principles. But like elsewhere, the industrial pull in existing contracts mean exports haven't stopped as of 2025.
So it seems whether it's the UK's big jump, the US's steady massive support, or France's smaller but continuing sales, the defense economic ties consistently seem to win out over the humanitarian rhetoric.
Largely, yes. The material interests, whether strategic or economic, appear incredibly resilient. Which does raise that fascinating question. If the real decisions are driven by these interests, what should we make of those big symbolic moments or legal challenges we saw in 2024 and 2025? Do they have any real teeth?
Right. Let's look at two key events. First, that mass walkout at the UN General Assembly in September 2025. That was quite a scene.
It really was. Over 50 delegations getting up and leaving as Prime Minister Netanyahu started his speech. That's a very deliberate, coordinated diplomatic signal.
50 delegations is huge. What's the actual impact of something like that? Does it change anything on the ground?
Directly. Maybe not immediately. But its power lies in symbolism and signaling. A mass walkout like that is designed to publicly strip the speaker, and by extension their state, of legitimacy within the international community. It's a visible demonstration of growing diplomatic isolation.
And how does that translate into risk for, say, businesses or investors?
It directly increases what analysts call the sovereign risk premium associated with Israel. That kind of dramatic, coordinated protest signals a worsening political climate. It tells investors and companies that the risk of future sanctions, boycotts, maybe divestment campaigns is rising. You track the policy, sure, but you absolutely have to track the protest too. It's a leading indicator.
Okay, so symbolism as a risk indicator. Now, what about the legal side? The ICC issuing arrest warrants in November 2024 for Netanyahu and Defense Minister Gallant. That felt like a major step.
Legally, it was huge. The warrants were for alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity in Gaza. Under the Rome Statute, the 124 countries that are members of the ICC have a legal obligation to arrest and surrender anyone with an active warrant if they enter their territory.
A legal obligation. But then Netanyahu traveled to New York in September 2025 for the UNGA while the warrant was active and he wasn't detained. What happened there?
Well, it perfectly illustrates the gap between international law on paper and its enforcement in reality. Two key factors were at play.
Okay.
First, the United States isn't a signatory to the Rome Statute. So while Netanyahu was on U.S. soil, the U.S. had no legal duty under the treaty to arrest him.
Ah, the non-signatory shield.
Exactly. And second, reports suggested his flight path to New York was very carefully planned to avoid flying over the airspace of any country that is an ICC member state and would have had that obligation.
So international law effectively neutered by a combination of non-participation by a major power and careful travel planning.
Pretty much. It highlights that executing these warrants depends entirely on individual state cooperation and the prevailing geopolitical winds. The legal framework exists, but the political will to enforce it, especially against leaders of states with powerful allies, is often lacking.
It really drives home the limits of enforcement, doesn't it?
It's a sobering reality.
Yeah.
When you see sitting heads of government under ICC warrants still able to travel to places like New York, protected by non-signatory status, it shows that international law often functions more as a statement of norms, a moral pressure point, rather than a consistently enforceable mandate.
Right. So let's try to bring all these threads together now. We've seen the voting record, UK and France often voting yes on humanitarian issues at the UN, the US often vetoing or voting no. But then the export data shows a different story. The UK spike, the huge US baseline, France's continued sales.
The divergence is clear and, frankly, fundamental. These contradictions do serious damage to the credibility of nations that want to be seen as leaders on humanitarian issues. It fuels perceptions of hypocrisy and erodes their diplomatic influence over time.
Okay, so for our listener, needing clear takeaways from all this, the UK court case, the US vetoes, the French Balancing Act, the symbolic walkout, the ICC warrant limitations, what are the most crucial predictive insights for an analyst navigating this landscape right now?
I think we can boil it down to three key points, where stated intentions often fail to predict actual state behavior.
Go by.
First, the alliance override is real. The UK High Court decision basically codified it. When core industrial or alliance commitments like a NATO supply chain are in play, expect them to override stated IHL concerns in Western democracies. Don't bet on those supply chains breaking easily based on rhetoric alone.
Okay, point one. Alliances trump rhetoric. What's two?
Second, symbolism signals risk shifts. Don't dismiss symbolic actions like that mass walkout. While they lack immediate enforcement power, they are powerful leading indicators. They signal a tangible shift in the political environment and an increase in that sovereign risk premium we talked about, often foreshadowing future regulatory or economic pressure much earlier than formal policy changes.
Got it. Symbolism matters as an early warning. And the third point.
Third, diplomatic protection holds strong. The ICC warrant situation proved it. When a major power, especially non-signatory like the U.S., provides diplomatic cover, international legal instruments, even arrest warrants, can be effectively bypassed. Enforcement remains fundamentally political, not purely legal.
So putting it all together, this deep dive really confirms it. You can't just listen to the speeches. The true picture of state behavior emerges only when you look at that messy intersection of diplomatic talk, defense money, and the very real limits of legal enforcement.
Absolutely. What nations declare versus what they materially practice often diverge sharply. Understanding that divergence is key to seeing the risks and also, frankly, the predictable patterns that emerge from these contradictions.
Which leaves us with a pretty challenging thought to end on, doesn't it?
I think so.
If these defense supply chains and alliance needs consistently function as the get-out clause for international humanitarian law, and if leaders under international arrest warrants can still address the UN without consequence, well, how long before governments just stop bothering with the humanitarian rhetoric altogether?
How long before the contradiction just becomes the accepted norm? Something for you to think about as you watch that gap between principles and practice continue to play out on the world stage?